Welcome everybody to the launch of the Legatum Prosperity Index 2014. You are very welcome. I'm the Executive Director, Sian, Hansen, and it's very nice to see so many new faces here. If you'd like to know more about the Legatum Institute, I encourage you to look out for our staff here at the event. They're wearing gold ribbons and they can help you, and certainly go to our website at any time. But let me tell you who we are. The Legatum Institute is an educational charity. We're a think tank, and what we do is promote prosperity in all its forms. We look to foster and enable prosperity over the globe. Tonight is our 8th annual Prosperity Index, and I'm pleased to say that we've had phenomenal coverage from all over the world this year. We've had Russia and Poland, Venezuela, Spain, Italy, Greece, you name it. We're just thrilled with the coverage we've had this year. And now, I'd like to introduce you, it's my great pleasure to introduce you, to the chair of our panel tonight. He's a senior advisor to Legatum Institute, James Barty.
We've got well, I think it's a fantastic panel. From our Ed Conway, who's the economics editor of Sky News. Then we've got Luke Johnson, who's a well-known entrepreneur, chairman of Risk Capital Partners, Baroness Wheatcroft, who I've known for a while from my policy exchange days, obviously Conservative life peer, but former editor of the Wall Street Journal and the Sun Telegraph. And then Edward Lucas, who's the senior editor at The Economist. Now, the topic for tonight, we thought we'd bring it back to the UK, so we're talking about British entrepreneurial spirit, and the basic plan for tonight is that I'm going to ask the panelists to speak for 3 to 5 minutes on their thoughts on this particular topic, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. Just one stat which Nathan actually didn't give you, maybe I can use this as a spark for the debate this evening, is that whilst we score quite well on our entrepreneurship and opportunity measure in the Prosperity Index, the global average for a country to be a good place for entrepreneurs to start a business is around about 70% on the Gallup polling. The UK only scores 67.3%, so we're a little bit below the global average there, even though we score very well. So perhaps our panelists can come up with some ideas of how we can increase the entrepreneurial spirit in the UK. But I'm going to start with Ed.
Okay, thank you, James. And actually, first of all, really what I was quite keen to talk about, because I was really struck actually reading about the Prosperity Index, just this question of how we value prosperity. You know, what do we define as prosperity? What satisfies us when it comes to both economics and social goods? And I work in economics journalism, and every month we get very, very obsessed with GDP data. Every month we get really, really focused on it. And every quarter we get an interview with the Chancellor, and there's such a focus on this. We are quite fixated with GDP. And the more I thought about it recently, a lot of these measures, it's not just GDP, but a lot of these measures are basically what we're quite good at measuring historically, rather than what we perhaps might be better off looking at. GDP is an interesting flow of money. It's a flow of income in the economy. It's not a stock. Inflation, again, is an interesting measure of how prices are going up, but it's not a kind of absolute measure of how well off people are or how kind of pressed they are. It's a similar story with so many of the different statistics we look at. We're obsessed with deficit figures, but not necessarily when it comes to the government. We're obsessed with the budget deficit, but not necessarily with debt, which enables the government to say, well, we are cutting the deficit has been cut in half. Isn't it amazing? And you actually look at the debt numbers, and it turns out they've gone up by 400 billion over the course of the last few years. Another thing we kind of focus on, and I'll kind of get to my point in a second, another thing we focus on an awful lot is current accounts. And we focus on the current account deficit. So I wonder if anyone actually knows there is a current account deficit, there is a budget deficit, government borrowing, the country as a whole borrowing. Now, most of us know that those government deficits add up to a national debt. But in the case of the current account deficit, there's something else. There's a measure called the international investment position, which is your overall position of the extent to which you as a country are overextended or not. We rarely ever talk about this in the press. Basically, I feel that we are kind of overly obsessed with measures that we have that are quite good at measuring flows and not very good at measures that actually look at kind of overall attainment. We're not particularly good at measuring overall wealth, as the whole kind of Thomas Piketty episode that we experienced recently showed us. So I think that it's good that the Legatum Institute is looking at this question and is trying to actually suggest some alternatives, and alternatives that aren't just kind of the twee things like gross national happiness, which I'm afraid is a little kind of twee. In terms of prosperity in general, I've spent quite a lot of the last few years studying John Maynard Keynes and his time. And in 1930, he wrote this great book, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, which is an excellent little essay which everyone should read. It's very short and quite fun. And the key takeaway from that, he made some predictions over how satisfied, how economically liberated we were going to be over the course of the next 100 years. This is 1930. And so essentially, he said, by 2030, we will be earning so much, kind of per capita, that we will only need to work 15 hours a week. And we'll have all of the rest of our time will be spare time. And instead, we've found more and more ways to work, more and more time to work. We work more than we ever did before, and we like spending more than we ever did before because we found lots of new exciting things to spend it on. A final point on that question of enterprise. I've spent kind of most of today covering a story about immigration, which is going to be all over the place tomorrow. It's embargoed, so I cannot say what the story is. But talking to a number of businesses in the UK, and this is, again, a key part of the report, one of the things that they value more than anything else is that free movement of labour. It's the freedom and the openness that the UK has when it comes to immigration. They talk about London. I was talking to a tech firm today. Can't tell you what it does, if I'm totally honest with you, but it's they have a ping pong table in their lobby, which I feel we all need to have more of. But they are in London because there are 3 places in the world where they know they can find the people who are going to work, who are going to have the skills to work for their firm. London, New York, Silicon Valley. I mean, that's kind of it. Maybe Berlin, but probably not, to be honest with you. And that's part of the reason for that is that the UK does have a kind of very open immigration policy, and many efforts have been made to try to shore up investment in tech. The worry is we're entering a period now where there is more and more political concern over immigration. But you look at the data and you look at the economic analyses, and it's very difficult to find any economic analyses that don't say this is a good thing. And so there is a worry now we're heading into a political time where we're going to be rather more kind of closed up about these kind of issues. And so some of those areas where the UK does do pretty well, I think, in the Legatum rankings, we need to safeguard against any backtracking on that in the future.
Fantastic, thanks, Ed. I'm now going to turn to Luke Johnson, who I'm hoping is going to tell us how we can sort of encourage entrepreneurship, particularly since he wrote a book called Start It Up, Why Running Your Own Business is Easier Than You Think. So, Luke.
Well, as ever, I'm very optimistic about enterprise in the UK. I think one of the most important things that underpins it all is the prevalence of rule of law and strong property rights in this country, which we take for granted here, but are absent in the vast majority of those 142 countries. We have the fastest growing economy in the OECD in 2014, over 3% this year expected. All-time high numbers of new companies created in 2013, over 500,000 according to Startup Britain. We are a diverse and tolerant nation, as Ed said. Over 1 in 7 companies in the UK was formed by a migrant, according to the Centre for Entrepreneurs, a sister think tank to Legatum. 14% growth last year in foreign direct investment, highest ever level. We are the most popular destination for FDI in Europe. The number of self-employed in this country has risen to an all-time high of almost 15% of those overwork. By 2018, it's estimated that there will be 5 million people working for themselves, more than will work for the government. That's the first time that's happened in 50 years. This is a long-term structural trend, which I think is very healthy. Since 2010, the UK has created 1.8 million new private sector jobs, more than all the rest of the EU countries put together. In terms of ease of doing business, lack of corruption and cronyism, I would argue that we are amongst the very most attractive nations in the world. Britain is unquestionably the European capital for venture capital, for private equity, and I think now is regarded as the leading city in the world for crowdfunding of new projects. AIM, I would argue, is the world's leading stock exchange for micro businesses. Britain boasts 4 of the top 10 universities in the world, according to QS rankings. Nowhere else in Europe comes remotely close. Obviously, we need to do better on overall investment, although the signs there are good. R&D, productivity, exports, and debt reduction. But I think as a nation, we can boast lower interest rates, a strong and stable currency, a modest regulatory burden compared to most economies of a similar size. And I think if you adjust the Legatum figures for economy size, Britain will be a lot higher than 13th. And therefore, I feel incredibly positive about the future for Britain as an enterprising nation.
Thank you. And it is worth pointing out that, as we flagged in all our press releases, the UK actually did come out as the top-placed major EU nation in the Prosperity Index. Patience.
Well, it being a horrible, damp night, I got a taxi to come over here. And the cabbie asked me what was going on at the Royal Academy, and I told him I was here to talk about the enterprise spirit in Britain. And he said, quite succinctly, it helps if you have to, doesn't it? And I think that that's been one of the major deciding factors in recent years. People have had to go and set up on their own because the jobs simply weren't there. And actually, some of the changes that have come about in welfare reform under this government and are only now beginning to hit home are going to encourage that trend further, I think. People are having to rediscover an enterprise spirit which had gone quite dormant in some parts of the country. But the problem, I think, is that many of our businesses start small, inevitably, and they don't actually grow into the sort of big businesses that we'd like to have. And there are all sorts of reasons for that, but I think they still do need addressing. I don't believe that actually it's a shortage of money. You know, government after government worries about the funding gap for small business and tries to find a way around it. Actually, the funding gap isn't really a problem, I don't think. Money is available in all sorts of different ways. The problem is that too many people think they want debt when what they actually need is equity. And there is a deep, deep reluctance in this country to give away, as they see it, part of the business you've set up. And there has to be a sea change in the way people address that. And it's something that Xavier Rollet at the Stock Exchange is trying to encourage. But it's so deep in the national psyche that it's going to be difficult to change, I think. I've listened to entrepreneurs telling me that they would rather sell their grandmother, literally, than sell any of the business. And so I think we have to try and address that. And until we do, we aren't going to see enough of our businesses going from being small enterprises to being big enterprises. What would help them is if they could export more, and we're still very bad about getting our medium-sized businesses to export. There's a real drive on there. Lord Livingston is not going to try the impossible of getting small companies to export. He is working very hard as Trade Minister to get medium-sized companies focused on exporting, and he's written personally to every one of those companies telling them that UKTI is now geared up to help. And it's a much better organisation than it used to be. There may still be flaws in UKTI, but it is there to help companies export. So I think that's a good thing. Yes, there are various moves that are helping create entrepreneurs. I don't think we should dismiss the Prince's Trust, for instance, which is fantastic about getting young people into business. And now, and this was relatively new to me, there's something called Prime, which is the Prince's drive to get mature businesses working. And over 50s, for the first time really, are beginning to become more enthusiastic about setting up their own businesses. And that's a confluence of all sorts of influences. A, they're finding themselves in the jobs market again. B, they're looking ahead at the prospect of working for maybe 20 more years. Why not start off on your own and have your own business for 20 years? So that's all positive. The negative that I think I would just come out with is that there are too many people in this country still who are hostile to business. And I was reminded about that because I was looking today at the long-running attempt to create a free trade zone between the EU and the US, which is to be much desired. It's been talked about since 2007. It would clearly be a benefit to both these major trading zones. The major dissenters are in this country, and they are the usual suspects. They're the trade unions, they're the Greens, they're the animal rights activists, and they're the people who think that the NHS is sacrosanct and will perceive a threat to the NHS absolutely anywhere. And currently, they perceive a free trade agreement between the EU and the US as a threat to the National Health Service. This is clearly mad, but they are making such a fuss that it's highly unlikely that this important agreement will be signed next year, if at all. And I do think we have too many siren voices wanting to make life difficult for enterprise.
That's very good, and I agree with a huge amount of that. Interestingly, I know you didn't mention the French film business, which is always quite high up on that list. Now, I must say a special thank you to Edward Lucas, who stepped in at the last minute for Steve Baker. Unfortunately, was called away by a parliamentary whip this afternoon. So, Edward, what would you like to say?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I endorse most of what everybody else has said, and I particularly was glad that Patience mentioned the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is much easier to call TTIP. And if you just go onto Twitter and look at hashtag TTIP, you'll see exactly what Patience is talking about. There are 1,001 arguments, most of them, though not all of them, bogus against TTIP, and there's no one really out there making the case for what would be the biggest global free trade zone, but also, I think, perhaps even more importantly, a kind of global rule-setting body which would make sure that the world is run on the principles of the rule of law and of multilateral obligations rather than the way that some of the other economies would like it, most of which I note have done rather badly in the Prosperity Index. I also think it's very important to bear in mind the cultural background to entrepreneurship, which has changed, although it's always been good in this country. When I was a student in Germany, I remember explaining to my German host family that it was possible to start a business in Britain without having a university degree. And they found this absolutely shocking. And if only I'd known then that Bill Gates was a Harvard dropout and Microsoft, which I could have invested in all those years ago, was going to be one of the most successful countries in the world, I'd have said, look at Bill Gates. He didn't finish Harvard and went on to found Microsoft, but in those days, no one had heard of Microsoft or of Bill Gates. But it is worth bearing in mind that a lot of these companies, which have become so successful both in this country and in Richard Branson, perhaps, in this country, and many, many examples elsewhere, you just wouldn't be able to do that because legally you can't found a company unless A, you've got quite a lot of money, and B, you've got letters after your name. But we've talked a lot here about business in the abstract, and I thought it might be just interesting to focus on one particular business which I think exemplifies what Britain is very good at, which is a bit of disruptive finance. Now, disruptive finance is not making a nuisance of yourself in the bank because you can't get a loan. Disruptive finance is setting up financial businesses that short-circuit the banks. And I think if you look on your seats, if you haven't sat on them, I produced what is sort of the ideal economist graph, which is a nice clear line going upwards. We also like nice clear lines going downwards, which just shows the cumulative lending by members of the Peer-to-Peer Financial Association over the last, 4 years. And you may have dimly heard of these companies. They've got names like Zopa, Rate Setter, Funding Circle. There's other ones as well. Those are the main ones. In America, there's another very big one called Lending Club. There's a number of European ones, notably Bondora from Estonia. And what they're doing is, I think, unblocking the financial system by putting lenders and borrowers in touch with each other directly, but on the basis of very, very small loans. So if you have €500 or £500 you want to invest, you lend it in 100 £5 chunks. And then although some of the people you're lending to may not pay it back, overall your risk is very well spread, and you're going to earn a much better rate of return than you'll get in the banks. So typically the peer-to-peer lenders are paying 6 or 7% to their lenders, and they're charging 7 or 8% to the borrowers, which is a much more natural rate of interest than the one the Bank of England is trying to inflict on us. And I just like this because it's an example of how you can take what seems like the absolutely immovable cartel-like iceberg of the 4 clearing banks with their phony-free banking, their computer-based, computer says no lending models. They capsized the economy almost by their behaviour. It'd be perhaps a little bit harsh. I know we have the British Bankers Association here on the panel, but there's a lot of quite serious questions about the way the banks have operated the last few years. And here's this business that is set up just by a couple of guys leaving an investment bank, a couple of guys out of business school, a 24-year-old who just leaves his business school halfway through because he sees an opportunity. And this has turned into a business which is going to lend £1 billion this year and is growing at a rate of 300% a year. So I just wanted to commend that to you as an example of something that I think is it's possible in Britain, it's possible in Estonia, it's possible possibly in 1 or 2 other European countries, but very difficult. There's something in the air in this country that means you can go and do something like that and make a huge difference. I commend that to you. It's all there on the internet. Go and please take a look at it.
Ed, thank you very much. As a matter of record, I should point out I'm the person from the British Bankers Association on the panel here. I'm Director of Strategy there. I should also point out that we actually have a large number of challenger banks that actually are members of the British Bankers Association who are also doing a fantastic job of actually providing credit into the economy. I think Shawbrook, who I recently had dinner with, they've gone from nothing to a £2 billion balance sheet in a small matter of years. Aldermore will be another one. Metro Bank, who you've probably seen expanding their branches around. So I actually think, interestingly enough, it's not just the peer-to-peer lenders, but there's other areas of banking where you are seeing some entrepreneurial spirit. And if you haven't met some of those guys that chair these challenger banks, they're worth chatting to as well. Fantastic. Well, I'm going to wrap it up there. I would like to, can we first of all thank all the panelists for I think it was an excellent panel debate.